This is something that happened to me and my wife Jillian at our apartment. After this incident, we moved out of that place and never looked back. It was a one-bedroom above a retail store in the old part of our town. It was an old building, and it had thin walls and a lot of quirks. The pipes were noisy, and we shared hot water with the neighbor, so if he took a shower, then we might not have hot water. It was cheap though, and it was all we could afford at the time. We had gotten married right out of college, and my wife had not found work yet. The way the building was laid out was that there was a single entrance at the back alley. The stairs up to our apartment were shared with our neighbor, and it was just the two apartments that used it. Our neighbor Alan was an older guy, probably 50 years old. He seemed decent most of the time when we saw him, but he had some issues. He was definitely a drinker, and we thought he was into some harder drugs as well. When sober, Alan was a really quiet and soft-spoken person. However, late at night, we would hear some disturbing things coming from his place. Whether it was crashing noises or yelling, it was like there was always something going on over there. We were worried most of the time when that happened. Because of that, we tried to keep our distance from Alan. Whenever we saw him during the day, he would be very apologetic about whatever commotion happened the night before. It kept happening though, and we got sick of listening to his excuses. We were laying awake one night, and there were people yelling next door. Alan lived alone, but there were always people over there. If I had to guess, there were probably at least 3 other people with Alan. We suspected that he was either buying or selling drugs to them. That's because the conversation didn't seem friendly. We could usually hear what they were saying, and that gave it away for the most part. Suddenly, I heard the downstairs door open. Someone started stomping up the stairs. I got out of bed and walked to the door. I peered through the peephole and saw a man walking up the stairs. This guy was tall and thin, with a bald head and a tattoo on his face. He seemed like the kind of guy who you would avoid on the street. I didn't want to judge, but I couldn't help it. The man walked past our door and burst into Alan's apartment. I walked back to my bedroom and told Jillian what I saw. We still thought it was just another night of Alan's antics, but as soon as the other man walked in, they went silent. Then we heard a shrill scream out of nowhere. That was followed by a loud gurgling noise. I don't know how else to describe it. Then it went silent again. If we listened closely, we could hear some whispers. We couldn't tell exactly what they were saying at that point. Next, we heard Alan's door open. Jillian stayed in our bedroom, but I was curious, so I tiptoed over to the door again and looked out the peephole. I saw 2 men. Neither of them were Alan, and they were carrying a third man down the stairs. I could hardly believe what I was seeing. Had they killed that man? I had no idea. I walked back to the bedroom. I was still shaking uncontrollably. When I told Jillian what happened, she said that we should call the police. I didn't want to at first, but then we heard Alan's door open again. He stomped up to our door and then started pounding on it. That was when we realized that he probably heard the word police coming from us. He pounded on the door for a few seconds, and then it started to seem like he was trying to break in. I looked over to Jillian, and she already had her phone out to call the police. There was no discussion now. I knew she needed to call. Luckily, our door held for long enough. The police got there and arrested Alan. He spent the night in jail for what he did to us, but we also told them about what we saw and heard leading up to that. I did my best to describe the man, but it didn't match anybody who had been reported missing, so they had to let him go. Before they could do that, we packed up what we could and moved in with my sister until we could find another place. That night will always give me nightmares. I really think they killed that guy in that place while we were laying in bed listening. We were scared for a long time that Alan or one of his friends would come after us for snitching, but they didn't. We never saw him again, and this happened over 10 years ago. I grew up in a suburb, a few miles outside of a small town. It was home to mostly elderly couples, so my twin sister and I only had each other to play with. When we first moved into the neighborhood, it was summer, and we spent most of our days outside. None of our neighbors paid us much mind, except for one man who lived a few houses down. The most distinct features I remember about him were that he had gray hair and a well-trimmed beard. He started off by just smiling and waving as he drove by in his black truck. We were very shy children, so it took us a long time to even acknowledge him back. He just seemed friendly after a while. One thing that I should mention is that my parents had us very young, so they did what they thought was best at the time. My mom was a night shift nurse, and my dad worked a job that I can no longer recall. My mom would stay home with us during the day and catch up on sleep. Then my father would take his turn at night. As I mentioned before, we spent most of our time in our front yard, and we were rarely supervised. The man drove by our house several times a day, but we never thought much of it. The waves and smiles then turned to him slowing down to say hello. Then he began to ask us what games we were playing. He took more interest in what we were doing. At some point along the way, he started calling us his girlfriends. We just thought it was a silly joke between the three of us, and we never gave it much thought. On our first birthday at the new house, our dad got us a puppy. She was a collie mix, and we named her Rosie. We never left her out of our sight when we were outside. She always wanted to do what we were doing. The neighbor asked us if she was a birthday present, to which we replied yes. He made the comment of how cute the three of us were, running around in the yard. Again, I thought nothing of it, and just went back to playing. Unfortunately, Rosie didn't live very long. She developed a habit of chasing cars shortly after we got her. That was the only time that she would leave our side. One morning, about 2 months after we got her, we were waiting in our driveway for the mailman, and when he pulled away, Rosie went. That was the last time, and it happened right in front of us. My sister was so shocked she couldn't move. I had to be the one to tell Mom. That evening when Dad got home, we buried her under a tree beside our house. A few days after that, our neighbor asked where Rosie was. Our neighbor asked what happened to Rosie, and I remember crying as we told him. This was the only time he got out of his truck when we talked to him. He hugged us, said he was sorry about what happened to our dog, and then got back into his truck. He came back a few minutes later with about 10 pictures in his hand. They were all of my sister and I playing with Rosie in our front yard. He told us he thought she was a pretty dog. He said that we could keep the pictures, and then drove off. My sister took them inside and put them in her shoebox of memorabilia, where they sat forgotten for several years. We were probably juniors in high school when my sister opened that shoebox again. She decided to pin the pictures of us and Rosie on her corkboard, since they were fond childhood memories. She's a very sentimental person. We called our mom in to show her what we had found. She asked us where we got the pictures from. We told her they were from the neighbor who lived down the street from us. He had moved a couple years before, but we explained to her that he gave us the pictures of Rosie after she was run over. Realization started creeping in, and I could see it on my sister's face too. He never talked to y'all, did he? My mom's voice rose with concern. He talked to us almost every day. He even called us his girlfriends, and would sometimes ask if we wanted to play in his yard. We were all silent after that. Nothing even happened to us, and we couldn't even remember the guy's name to do a Google search on him, but we all felt the weight of what could have happened. Another question was, since he took those pictures of us with our dog, did that mean that he had more pictures that he didn't give us? Fortunately, we never went with him. We never left the yard, and we would never leave with anyone we didn't know, no matter how friendly they were. So to the neighbor from my childhood, I'm not your girlfriend. I share an apartment with my roommate. We'll call her Sarah. Our place was cozy, and we had developed a comfortable routine. I was 31 at the time. Most people get their own place by then, but I liked living with someone else. It made me feel more safe. We'd known each other since college, and our personalities clicked perfectly. It was a 2-bedroom apartment in a decent building. We had settled into our daily lives, immersed in work, occasional outings, and the comfort of each other's company. One night, however, would change the way we felt about the safety of our home forever. I remember it as if it were yesterday, even though it was over 5 years ago. It was a typical Thursday evening, when Sarah and I decided to catch up on our favorite TV shows. We settled onto the couch with some snacks. We talked about our days and shared some silly gossip. It was a relaxing evening, and we were both looking forward to a quiet night's sleep. As the clock struck midnight, we finally decided to call it a night. I headed to my room, while Sarah headed to hers. I changed into my comfortable clothes and went to bed. Just as I was about to close my eyes, I heard the sound of footsteps in the hallway. I assumed it was Sarah, probably grabbing a glass of water or something. However, the footsteps didn't stop at her room. They continued towards my bedroom. Confusion mingled with fear as I sat up, straining to listen. The door to my room creaked open slowly, and my heart raced. Before I could react, Sarah's voice broke the silence. "There's someone in the house," she whispered, her voice trembling. I sprang out of bed and turned my gaze towards the doorway. There he was, a man standing in the hallway. He was tall, with a disheveled appearance. I recognized him. I'd seen him around the building. He was one of our neighbors. My breath caught in my throat as I struggled to process what was happening. Just then, I slammed my door and blocked it with my body. Then I heard footsteps again. He was coming for me. He started banging on my door and trying to open it. I screamed for Sarah to call the police. Then I heard her yell for the man to leave, because the police were on their way. The banging continued for another 10 seconds, and then it stopped. I heard the man leave at that moment. When the police finally arrived, we told them everything. We told them that he was one of our neighbors, but we weren't sure which apartment was his. With the description we gave them, they were able to track him down and arrest him. We never found out what he wanted, but I think it's fair to say that the guy was not right in the head. There are 2 lessons I learned from this experience. One is to never live alone, and the other is to always lock your damn doors. I lived in my old apartment for about 5 years. In the time that I stayed there, the apartment next to me saw a lot of different people. I never really got to know any of them, but this story is about one neighbor who I'll never forget. My place was a small bachelor in one of the cheaper buildings in my area. It was on the 9th floor, with a pretty nice view of the city. My place was at the end of the hallway, so I only had a neighbor on one side. At the other end of the hallway was the garbage chute. It smelled a little, but the stink never made it to my end of the hall. There were 2 stairwells on the floor. One was next to the garbage chute, and the other was right across from my door. That staircase got very little use, since most people use the elevator anyway. Another thing that I'll mention is that the walls in the building were really thick. I don't think I ever heard a single noise from my neighbor. In fact, one time my next door neighbor moved out and another moved in without me even noticing. Therefore, I genuinely didn't know if my neighbor was there or not. I imagine the same was true for them. One day, I was in the elevator with someone who I had never seen before. It was a guy around my age. I was 26. He hit the button for the 9th floor. When I noticed that, I introduced myself. He said his name was Darren, and he seemed like a nice guy. He was wearing gym clothes, and he seemed to be in really good shape. It made me think that I should join the gym. After that, I didn't see Darren again for a while. We both kept to ourselves, but saw each other in passing from time to time. One day, I walked out of my apartment into the hall, and a smell hit me. It was a really terrible smell, like rotting garbage. I thought it was coming from the garbage chute on the other end of the hall, but when I walked over there, the smell faded. It wasn't coming from there. One of my neighbors must have left some garbage for too long, I thought. As the days went on, it got worse and worse. Eventually, it became unbearable. I didn't know where it was coming from, and I couldn't understand how my neighbor didn't notice it. If it was coming from his place, then there'd be no way that he could bear it. It was that bad. I was about to tell the building superintendent, but on a whim, I decided to check the stairwell across from my door. As soon as I opened it, I saw a body lying face down. I quickly shut the door and ran into my apartment and locked it. I thought there was a murderer on the loose. I quickly called 911. The police came moments later, and I was relieved to see them. They took the body away, and I talked to one of the officers. The deceased was identified as my next-door neighbor Darren. That would explain why he didn't notice the smell. I thought at that point that he was murdered, but that wasn't true. It turned out that Darren had been running up and down the stairs for exercise. The police determined that he simply lost his balance and fell, hitting his head on the concrete stairs, killing him. He laid there dead for days, waiting to be found. The whole time, I was feet away from that poor guy, a victim of a freak accident. It shook our building pretty hard. Our management added cameras into the staircase. I don't personally see how that would help, but I think they felt like they needed to do something. In my opinion, it was a tragic accident, and I'm not sure if there's any way to prevent things like that from happening. He was just trying to get some exercise, and ended up dead. I still think about him, often.